Mirasee. A man set off to find truth. He travelled for days that turned into weeks, and then months and years. Everywhere he went, village, town, or city, he asked people, "Do you know where truth lives?" Most people had no idea, and little interest. Sometimes a person would suggest that he search out a certain street or a particular town, but no matter where he went, he could not find truth. That is, until one day when he reached a small village where they told him that if he were to go to the hill, the one after the next, at the very top he would find a small house, and it was said that truth lived in that house. Hi, I'm Lisa Bloom, the story coach, and you're listening to Once Upon a Business. Each episode, we're going to explore a story, a fairy tale, folk tale, or traditional story, so that we can discover the amazing lessons relevant for business and for entrepreneurs. It took the man a day and a half to reach the house on the top of the second hill. He knocked on the door. The old woman who opened the door was small and stooped. She had long grey hair and a scarred, wrinkled face. But when he looked in her eyes, he knew he had found truth. He said, "I have been searching for truth." She opened the door wide and moved aside. "Come in," she replied. The man stayed there for a long time. It could have been days or months, he couldn't tell. He was learning all there was to know about truth. And after enough time had passed, they knew that it was time for him to return to the world. Just before he left, he asked her, "Is there anything you would like me to tell the world about you? Is there anything that you want the world to know about truth?" The old woman thought for a while, and then she said, "If they ask you what truth looks like, tell them I'm young and beautiful." What happens when we tell stories, I think, is super interesting. And it's one of the things I noticed that got me into the whole concept of stories in business, which was that I noticed people would have these experiences and then they'd go tell somebody. And that going to tell somebody about what happened to them is this basic human instinct. We have something happen, we go tell our friends or our partners or our parents or our children. But what happens in the telling is that a huge percentage of what we tell is our interpretation of what happened. There's maybe a few percent which is pure fact. But as we tell that story and as we absorb the reaction to that story, and by the time we've told the story a couple of times, it becomes the truth, almost as if we act as if it just landed upon us. We had nothing to do with it. And it's just this objective truth, when in reality, we've made up this story. I found that to be an incredibly interesting concept when we apply it to how we tell the stories of our lives and how we tell the stories of our business. There is no absolute truth. There is the experience that we've had and the interpretation of it, and that becomes our story. I think this story, Searching for Truth, speaks to how there is no absolute truth, there is no absolute beauty, but we can intentionally create the stories that will be powerful for us, that will have the kind of impact we want to have. And that's what's ultimately so exciting about using story in business, because we create the truth as we tell the story. So when people hear this story, usually they laugh and then they go, they wonder, what exactly does that mean? Which is actually part of what I love about the story. And I've asked myself again and again, and I've asked people, so what does it mean for you? And people come up with lots of ideas, and I've come up with lots of ideas, and I'm not sure there is one interpretation of any story that's the absolute meaning. But often I wonder, so does truth want others to seek her? Is that why he tells her that he should say that she's young and beautiful? And then if he does that, will they even recognize her if they're expecting a young and beautiful woman? So that's kind of almost a surface level. Perhaps that's a reason that she says it. But I actually think there's a much deeper level. Perhaps she's trying to say that truth is always beautiful. And we have to be able to see beyond the external presentation to see the beauty. Or perhaps she means that we're often confused and we're pushed away by what seems ugly and undesirable. But within everything, there is beauty. And in the business context, it's kind of interesting. I mean, the call is for youth and beauty. Often it's what brings people in if we make things look perfect, if we make things look absolutely beautiful. But when you get down to the work itself may seem, ugly and desirable. And yet if we're doing true work, if we're doing authentic work, the beauty will always emerge. And to me, it speaks of work ethic even, moving away from this idea of instant gratification to the real work of finding truth. You have to dig deeper. You have to see beyond the old age and the wrinkles. You have to see beyond the difficulties and the trials and tribulations of building a business to be able to dig deep into the real work and find the beauty. In many of the traditional stories, there's a play on the archetype of the old woman, the crone, the keeper of the truth. Often there's this undesirable or even frightening external layer to get beyond before you can see or understand truth and beauty. And this story aligns culturally from that perspective of the archetype. The woman who opens the door, the woman who is the embodiment of truth, is somehow undesirable. She's stooped, she's got wrinkles, and yet ultimately she says, tell them I'm beautiful. And perhaps the message here is that age is beautiful. Age is wisdom. Age is something much more deep and meaningful than simply beauty. And so I would love to be able to articulate in our businesses the values that go way beyond that surface assumption of what we see in front of us. The archetype of the crone of this old and somewhat ugly woman is actually a very, very powerful person. She's the keeper of the truth. There is nothing more valuable than that. And so I think in our businesses, if we can understand that it doesn't matter what it looks like, it doesn't matter how much, ugliness is in there necessarily, or even examine the question, what is ugly? What is beauty? And why is that a value that we have to move towards rather than wisdom and truth? I love this idea that we can see things that others would say were ugly and see them for the beauty that they are, simply because they're wise, they're smart, they're full of value. That's the kind of business I'd like to be involved in. That's the kind of business that aligns with my values, is where we can see the value and the beauty of that wisdom and that truth that's there. And it's got nothing to do with what it looks like on the surface. So we know that old expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. One person sees one thing as beautiful and sees something else. Somebody else will see that same thing as not beautiful. I think it's the same with truth, and certainly from a perspective of story. Truth is what a person experiences as truth. There is no completely objective truth when it comes to story. So, for example, my sister and I will have a memory of something in our childhood, and often I'll turn around to her and I'll say, did we live in the same house? Did we experience the same thing? Because our memory, the story we tell about this experience is so different that it almost feels like, where's the truth here? What actually happened? And what I see again and again in our lives and in business is that we tell this so-called truth because it is the perspective that we have based on the story we tell ourselves and others, based on what's happened. And it's completely subjective. So in this story, we see this young man going out into the world, and it takes him a long time, and it's a huge search, and he's tried many, many places to find truth. And it's only finally through his perseverance and his tenacity that he actually finds that house on the top of the hill. And I think it's really interesting because there are amazing stories out there of businesses where their attempts have failed and they've had to iterate again and again and again. The one that comes to mind for me is always the one I learned in business school around Dyson. Dyson tried to make this vacuum cleaner that didn't need a bag, an internal bag. And he would try and try and try and try. And there were so many attempts. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was tens of attempts until he finally found one that worked. And we see the same with many companies where they try a product and they keep trying and they just don't give up. And oftentimes there's almost this culture, it goes back to what I spoke about, this culture of immediate gratification where you're going to do something and you're going to be an overnight success. And we forget about the 10 or 15 or 20 years that came before that overnight success. And so I love that this person in his search for truth, he went all out. He traveled the world because in business, that's what we need to do. We need to go all out. We need to keep trying. We need to keep pushing. We need to iterate. We need to change. We need to understand our market and understand our audience and keep finding what they need and keep trying new things. And that's what ultimately will bring us to the truth that will lead us to success. I'm Lisa Bloom, and you've been listening to Once Upon a Business. You can find out more about me at story-coach.com. That's story-coach.com. Once Upon a Business is part of the Mirasee FM podcast network, which also includes Making It, Just Between Coaches, and Course Lab. This episode of Once Upon a Business was produced by Cynthia Lamb. Jeff Govertson assembled the episode. Danny Innie is our executive producer. So you don't miss the episodes that are coming up on Once Upon a Business, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. And if you like the show, please leave us a starred review. It really does help us out. Thank you. We'll see you next time.